Thanks so much, Ethan. I'm grateful to be here.
Yeah. If you could, can you open us up with just giving us like a brief overview? What is your book about? What is its genesis?
Well, it's got two um, beginnings. One is in my own life. Um, I, as I also wrote in my first book about the life of the mind,
Hmm.
I quit. I'm a academic philosopher, but I quit the profession um, about 15 years ago and went to live. I joined a Catholic religious community in rural Ontario, and then discerned back out and have been teaching and writing since then. But I wanted to write about that experience in order to demystify it a bit. I don't think that in Catholic cultures, uh, monks, nuns, hermits, other kinds of strange um, radical commitments to Christianity are a bit more familiar. They're less familiar in the United States, and they're less familiar in general overall these days as church attendance declines. And also, I think Christian spirituality is not well understood. So often Americans, when they're looking for spirituality, or Europeans, they go to Eastern spirituality, which is more obviously connects to their concerns. And Christianity has this incredible spiritual tradition that I wanted to try to bring out. So that's a personal origin and a sort of simple justification, but the book is also a story of my struggle with a particular question, which is about faith and happiness. That is
Mm.
whether Christian faith and Christian sacrifice contributes to one's happiness or involves the sacrifice of it. So that's the question that kind of animates the book that takes it from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious. I want to pick your brain on some of the findings that happened. But before we do that, I just want to backtrack and ask you, your background's in philosophy.
Mhm.
Why philosophy? Why is this something that you chose to do with your life?
You know, it. I don't think I identified as a young person as a philosopher or as being philosophically minded. But for me, it turned out that philosophy is. It took time for me to see that that's in fact what I'd been trying to do with my whole life. But it's a way of asking and pursuing the fundamental questions of human life. So, does God exist? What does it mean to be happy? What's the nature of the natural world? Um, how do we understand what's right and what's wrong? Can we imagine a just society? What's the good of imagining it? Is it possible or not? These are fundamental questions
Hmm.
that bear on how to live, especially, but also sometimes just deal with human beings and their relationship to their environment or the universe in general. So it's a way of asking and pursuing fundamental questions.
Hmm.
That's how I think of philosophy. And when I was a child, my parents and I used to get in these kinds of conversations. My brother, um, and then as I grew older, I learned its various academic forms and made
Mm.
my way into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you decided that you wanted to spend some time then by joining a monastery
Yeah.
or observing a monastery and their practices. Um, how much of how much of that experience was helpful for you when it comes to discerning and trying to figure out all these deep philosophical questions about the meaning of life? Like, tell us what that experience was like going into that community.
Sure. So just to be clear, I wasn't an observer. I
Mm.
went with the intention of thinking about joining a Catholic religious community, as this one was.
Hmm.
Is something that takes place in stages, so you can't commit to it all at once. You have to stay for a time as a guest, and then go through a formation program, and then you make temporary vows or promises, and it's some years before you would make a permanent commitment. But I did start that process. I was there for 3 years, so I was there for quite a long time, and made some way into that process. So I
Okay.
wasn't an observer. I was a full participant.
Yes.
Um, Even though I didn't stay in the long term. I didn't commit for life. Um, so that's one thing. But it had an extremely large impact on my life.
Mm.
Um, and my life divides into what happened before I went to this community, which is called Madonna House. It's in Eastern Ontario. They take guests. I'm just putting that out there for your listeners.
Mhm.
Um, and um, it, there's the time before I went, and there's the time after I went. And my life's very different. Now, I had already undergone a conversion to Roman Catholicism. I wasn't brought up in it some years before I went. But this was really where sort of the rubber hit the road. Now, it wasn't uh, the reason why the experience was formative was not um, just some kind of intellectual process. Um, it it helped to um, it helped me to examine and my motivations for living the way that I did, and to figure out what at bottom I felt myself most committed to. It
Mhm.
was a kind of self-examination of my motivations and my commitments. And one of the things that I think is really important for that, that's in a way the message of the book that's a little countercultural, is that in order to really examine your motivations and your commitments, you need to be prepared to make sacrifices. So to be in an environment like that, which lives under, so what's a religious community? It's one that lives under poverty, chastity, and obedience.
Mhm.
Okay. Those are the three what are called the evangelical councils. They define you could be a friar, you could be a hermit, you could be a monk, you could be a nun, but wherever you are, whatever you look like, you you commit yourself to poverty, chastity, and obedience. So I didn't commit myself to that for life in a way. I mean, in a way, I did. In a way, I didn't. Not within that community, but I did. For me to spend 3 years living under those rules, in order to really examine your motivations, living in an environment where that's restricted in certain ways is extremely useful. So you don't have, you're free from distractions. It was a very low technology environment. I
Mhm.
can check my email maybe once a week, you
Wow.
know. But there was no like net surfing, there was no video games, there was no very, very few movies. Um, it was a life that was immersed in uh, the non-virtual, the
Mhm.
physical, the real world, and the spiritual world. And so it was technologically restricted. There was no way for me to um, win the various competitions with which I normally distract myself. Asking the smartest question at the colloquium, or
Mhm.
you know, um, uh, churning out publications, or any of those kinds of things. Wearing the best outfit. None of that competition kind of had to drop away. There was no way for me to succeed on the terms that I had been accustomed to succeed on. I was just a regular person along with everyone else. People didn't know a lot about my background. So some people knew that I had been trained in academic philosophy, but a lot of people didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I was seen as more like a human being rather than someone with status. So I was able to see parts of my personality and so on. So it was the, and obedience means you can't really do what you want. Chastity means you can't date, or, you're not like looking to either date or get married or have a partnership of that kind during your time there. So I had it brings about a kind of intense focus, and it was that focus that really allowed me to clarify what what my life was about and what mattered most to me.
Yeah.
So it wasn't intellectual so much as it was, I'd call it motivational, volitional, a change in the way I was oriented,
Mhm. Yeah.
something like that.
What are a few things that you found really surprising. I think that maybe whenever you decided to enter into that religious life, you weren't fully expecting. You know, maybe that somebody like me who's never been in a community like that would have no idea what is something that is formational.
Yeah, here's one example of something I found surprisingly difficult. So, one of the things that happens in a community like that is you're with the people that you're with. There's
Mm-hmm.
people that you live with, and at Madonna House, it's quite intense kind of living. You live in dormitories, so you don't necessarily have your own room. Um, you live with the other people who happen to be there. When I entered the formation program to enter the community, I was with the other people who were in the formation program. You sit down to dinner, you sit down with the other people at your table. You can try to engineer it and only sit with people that you like, but that you run out of steam pretty fast. You can't really do that. So you work with the people that you happen to be assigned to work with. And I had not realized how much I relied on all of these little fussy things that I had in common with others, like
Mm.
these kind of chosen friendships. And like, so I've always prided myself on having all kinds of friends, you know, different political backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, but in fact they all had more in common than than these people did with me. So I had to find different ways of relating to others, different things to value in others, um, and it's in the context of a commitment to the highest Christian goal, which is charity. It's love of one's neighbor as oneself. Okay, it's love of another just in their humanity, insofar as they
Mhm.
are an image of God, and everyone's committed to that on the one hand, and on the other hand, everyone's just like a normal screwed up human being. So you have to. It's that tension um, that you had to navigate without recourse to your normal friend group, family group, natural affinities, or anything like that. That was the biggest challenge and the most exciting one for me, and the one that I think I learned the most from.
Yeah. Yeah, and how did all of these things transfer, I guess, to your everyday practical life now when you're not in that community? Were there things that you took with and left behind or what?
Um, I I have a sort of deep. I almost want to call it a muscle memory, although it's not quite appropriate, but it's like muscle memory of
Habit,
what
maybe.
it's like to really be at loggerheads with someone, like be unable to come to an agreement about what should happen,
Hmm.
but to know that that person is committed to the most deep principles of life that you are. So I have
Mm-hmm.
that kind of in my muscle memory. Now, the most workplaces, most environments don't really operate like that. So I can't always like so under the pressure of what's around me, I often just act like a normal person. But I remember what it was like. So I think I more often than not, I more often than I used to be able to can can handle it when things go wrong, when there's major disagreement, when the person in charge is doing something I think is just absolutely a huge mistake. I struggle with it like anyone does, but I remember I have these kinds of memories of um, techniques I used for dealing with it. That's one thing. Now, that's not the main difference. The main difference is that I was able to reorient myself so that I was living um, a life of the mind, which is what I'd always lived.
Mm-hmm.
But before the community, I was really living it for myself, for status and for my own advancement. And after that, since then, it's much more clear to me that I'm living it out of a sense of service, out of a sense of duty to others, out of a sense of what my mission as far as God's plan for me is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a more focused life, and in a way more balanced, and it's more peaceful because I think I'm oriented. At least I know where I'm supposed to be oriented, so I can keep finding my way back to that orientation.
Yeah.
Makes
Well,
sense.
as a philosopher, and I know you have a background in Aristotle as well,
Mhm.
specifically, did you notice that being a part of that community, there was a lot of continuity between your previous ways of understanding philosophy and even just like the teachings of Aristotle, or were there things that contradicted each other, or what was that like?
Well, I can say it this way, and this connects to what I was just talking about being reoriented. So Aristotle teaches that whether we like it or not, we're pursuing some ultimate end. So there is something, some implicit definition of happiness or well-being that guides everything that we do. We can see it in crises usually. It's hard to see otherwise because we deceive ourselves and we want to think certain things. But so there really is an answer to the question of am I living for status
Hmm.
or am I living for contemplation for its own sake? Um, that's not to say that it's pure, but there's one of those things they're always mixed together, your motivations, but there's one of those things that's really driving you and the other is not. And that's something you can learn about in philosophy in the abstract. But I think part of what I experienced is the reality of it. That is that you really can, if you connect yourself especially to a community that has a particular goal, you really can work to orient yourself so that your life has the kind of goal that you want it to have, where you're valuing what really matters to you most and not just drifting. Oops, did you lose me? Okay.
No?
I got a little notice about my internet connection. You're not just, most of us just drift on autopilot. You just do what's in front of you. You do what everyone else does. You do what's expected of you. And that's not a way to live a committed and well-oriented life. So you can learn that in the abstract, and then it's another thing to see how it's really possible for you. And that's what happened. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's awesome. You mentioned the fact that you were completely disconnected from social media and from browsing the internet, whatever.
okay.
Um, that sounds really appealing to me, because that's one of the main
It is
things that,
great. It is
yeah,
one. Yes.
I find in my life. I'm like I want to be a contemplative. I want to be practice
Yes.
spirituality often, and that's like the biggest roadblock.
Mhm.
Um, so how was it going 3 years without that roadblock at all?
Oh, it was amazing. I mean, that is
Really?
one of the things I miss the most. Um, I have to use email all the time now. It's
Hmm.
part of my professional life. And I use social media. I've been trying to wean myself off it recently, and I may be able to, but I used it to promote my first book, for instance, and
Hmm.
very successfully. I used it to build a nonprofit that I run that runs online Greek book seminars. So I used it, um, but it's living a life like that that's very concrete, where you're working with real stuff and real people all day, every day. It's how we're
Hmm.
supposed to live. And to the extent that we can do that, I think we still can. It's just so much effort. So you need to find people that will help you, allies and co-conspirators who can help to build a more tech-free existence. If you have friends who you can put each other under pressure to do it, it's the best. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Do you think that everybody should go experience living in a religious community? If they're, let's say you're a practicing Christian, would your advice to them be like, do it, even if it's for a few months, like just do it?
I think it's a really, really good idea. Not everyone can. Okay, so you
Hmm.
need to
Yeah.
be able to take time away from work, even a week at a place like
Yeah.
Madonna House, um, is can really help you to see what's possible in your life. I mean, when I talk about this autopilot force, like in over the course of my life, I'm not that old. I'm 50, but that's older than you. Um, but I've watched that autopilot become stronger and stronger. so that when I was younger, if you went to college, you might make your own way for a while. You might take big chances and go on big adventures. And people these days are much less inclined to do that. They're much more like on career tracks and headed in a particular direction. And so it's harder and harder to escape and actually just figure out who you are and what matters in life. And these communities are a wonderful place to do that. They're peaceful, they're quiet, they're places that have been they're model on places that have existed before there was electricity,
Yeah.
before there was running water. And if you want to be in touch with the human beings of the past so that they can teach us lessons about how to live better now, seeing how much you can give up is really, really useful. So I recommend it very highly uh, to believing Christians, frankly, to non-believers.
Really.
Um, I mean, I think it's um, if they can if they can if they can deal with all the religious people and their religious practices.
Yeah.
But I think you need to do something like that
Mm.
if you want to really escape from the pressures of contemporary life, which are really overwhelming, I think.
They are. They
Yeah.
are indeed. Yeah. Huh. Um, then you said they're normally, at least the community you were a part of, but I don't know if this is universal. They're pretty inviting, just with people and guests and.
So there are a variety of ways of being able to visit a religious community. So the monasteries, who are usually, there's so many religious orders in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church also. But so there's Benedictines, Cistercians. These are people who, Trappists, they have monasteries and they have a practice of hospitality where you can go for a time and stay. Now, in those cases, they're in what's called a cloister. So you
Mhm.
don't necessarily get to see what their life is like from the inside. So what Madonna House does that's quite unique, and I would recommend to anyone to take advantage of it, is that anyone can go and be a part of the life. That is, it's not the people there are totally committed, the permanent residents, but they open up their life to anyone who comes for as little time as a week, or 2 weeks, or a month, or a year. And that doesn't have to be. I went to discern a vocation, to discern a permanent commitment, but it doesn't
Mhm.
have to be that. It can just be a break. It can just be something like a retreat. Only you work pretty hard, so it doesn't always feel like a retreat. Um,
Mhm.
so I think it's a great way to experience the depths of Christian spirituality. And like I say, you can do it for a week, and there's no cost. It's donation if you can.
Yeah.
And I think in general monasteries practice that. That is, they might have a suggested donation, but
Mm.
if you don't have money, they won't refuse you.
You said you mentioned the work. Of course, you were there for 3 years,
Yeah.
and so you would have been working from the way I understand it. Every person has a different role that they do to support the community. What was your role looking like for the 3 years? What was your day-to-day activity kind of?
They move me around quite a lot. They do that with new people. So I worked in a kitchen for a while, one of the kitchens, helping to cook and for the community. Probably the most fun I had. I was a bread baker for a while for the whole
Oh
community.
wow.
So I had to bake like 60 loaves of bread a day in this big wood fire oven. I worked. There's a handicrafts department that also is involved in decorating for holidays and feast days. So I
Mm.
learned how to refurnish furniture and things like that. And I spent a long time also working they have a gift shop that's quite unique. They get all kinds of things in donation, and they sort out antiques or anything that's sort of fine. They sell it in the gift shop, and they send the proceeds to missions in the very poor countries. So it's a retail store where no one makes any money.
Wow.
The stock is all given and the proceeds all go to the poorest people. So that was quite fun. I did a fair amount of, that was where my research skills came in handy because
Yeah, I bet.
I could find out about it, the antiques and things like that. They also had a library. I worked in the library for a time, which is probably where I was most comfortable. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so there were a variety of jobs that I had, that all of which I learned a ton from. I mean, it's all very you always know why you're doing what you're doing in a place.
Hmm.
You're never doing busy work. Um, you always know why what you're doing matters, and that's
Yeah.
a real gift. That's something that's really hard to find, I think, in the
Yeah.
rest.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Um, so just going off the title of your book, I wanted to ask a question. It's titled "A Philosopher Looks at the Religious Life." What do you think you were able to, I guess, recognize or realize that maybe somebody who isn't a philosopher and goes and looks at the religious life, like what is your book being able to offer that's unique in that sense, just because of your background?
Well, I think what I did that's a bit distinctive is I ask why questions a lot.
Mm,
And I really try to understand the underpinnings of a thing. So, you can hear these stories like of monastic vocations. So, for instance, Anthony the Abbot, founder of Western monasticism, um, he goes to church one day and he hears the gospel of the rich young man. So
hmm
Jesus says, what do I need to do to gain eternal life? And he said, follow the commandments. I do that. Well, then give up everything you have and follow me. And he's like, and he goes away sad because he has many possessions. So Anthony hears this and he's like, okay. He gives away everything he has and he goes off into the desert. Um, so why I just wanted to figure out why would committing yourself to God involve giving things up, giving up money, giving up wealth, giving up a chosen community, giving up sex and marriage and family. And that is a philosophical question. So I,
hmm
I look at that from a philosophical point of view. Why would it, given that as I think, we're meant for happiness, we're meant
hmm
for fulfillment. How could it be fulfilling to give up everything that seems like your person would want?
hmm
Um, and I think there's an answer to that, which is that we we have so many conflicting motivations in the course of our ordinary life that we can't focus on the things that we care about most without being free,
hmm
without being able to take or leave things as we choose. And when we do that, we discover forms of love and commitment and service and work and community, and connection with other human beings and with God and in prayer that we wouldn't otherwise. So it really is necessary, but it's very mysterious, especially for
Yeah.
people like Americans like us, like we're so rich and comfortable and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Did you notice, I guess then, did you notice that the people in that community, the monks and the nuns and everybody else there, did you notice that they were happier than the people that you were used to being around outside of that community?
Well, it's interesting. It's definitely a happy, peaceful place. Like
Hmm.
the older people were the people that struck me the most.
Mm.
And they're on my mind a bit because one of the brilliant older people that everyone loved, just passed away a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
Um, but this woman had planted all of the apple orchards um, in the community in the late 40s, early 50s, like hundreds and hundreds of apple trees, and had looked after them her whole life, along with some other things. Like she was also in charge of the wool and other kinds of fruit growing and things like that. But she was just this person who was just so alive. The older people are so alive and so happy. That's where it's most striking. I think a life like that is hard. It is hard. It's less immediately gratifying than other things. And so people suffer visibly also, but they don't, they're not miserable the way that people on the outside are miserable. You don't have people who are empty inside or um, restlessly pursuing this or that kind of addiction, like a tech
Mm-hmm.
addiction, video game addiction, like whatever. Like you don't have so that it's it's not the ups and downs are not as big. Um, a lot of what we live with is kind of exaggerated ups and downs.
Mm.
So for that reason, unless you're really looking for me at least, unless you're looking at the older people, it's not, and you're looking at the whole community and the whole way of life, it's not obvious that it's the happiest place you've ever been. So you need to reflect on what it's really like to be on the outside world, where it's not just you get to have cookies every day,
Yeah.
but um, but that ability to have cookies every day um, just puts you on this, and all the other things go along with it, puts you on a roller coaster, and your lows are very low,
Mm-hmm.
and the highs are not quite real.
Yeah.
That's how I.
Wow, that's very perceptive. Thank you. Um, well, if people really want to go check out you and your work, what's the best place? I know you have a website. Is that where, if people want to look more into it and find out where they can get this book, is that where they should head to?
My website's a good place. It's a little out of date. I'm working on it.
Okay.
Just to be perfectly straightforward. Um, but also my Twitter. I keep up a Twitter. It's becoming more simple and so easier to just find stuff that you might be interested in. But my website's a good place to find the books and a couple of articles, or just a good Google search. I have other podcasts, interviews, stuff like that, essays.
Okay,
Uh,
awesome.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for your time. Thank you for inviting me.